We are also very honored that Michel Garneau and Jean-François Soussana have accepted to give talks to these annual days. And in a minute, I will give the floor to Jean-François, who will give the first talk entitled Public Climate Actions, Food Systems, Land Use and Forests. So Jean-François Soussana is Vice President of INRAE and also President du Haut Conseil pour le climat. Jean-François is a famous researcher in the field of ecosystem and climate change and is coordinating plenty of national, European and international projects and programs related to agriculture, soil and climate change. Jean-François is also taking part to the IPCC works as the main author since 1998 and was awarded the Nobel Prize of Peace in 2007 with the other IPCC authors. So I would like to sincerely thank you, Jean-François, for accepting to give the first talks of these annual days. And I wish you all a very nice FairCarboN annual days in Sète. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Pierre, and I'm glad to be invited. But I was thinking I would speak in French, so I don't know if you like me to speak in English or in French, Pierre.
If you can speak in English, it would be better, but is it okay for you?
Yes, I will try, because there are a lot of words which are from the French policy, so I'm not sure it's really so easy, but maybe I will switch to French from time to time if I cannot make it. I didn't prepare in English, but however, let me introduce to you this High Council for Climate that is the National Climate Change Committee in France, and I will address what is happening with climate policies in France, especially with focus on food systems, land use change, and forestry. So I will move to the next slide, and I hope it works. Yes, it does work. So this committee has 13 independent experts, and we are reporting to the government, especially with annual reports. And what is quite interesting is that we get feedback from the governments to our recommendations within 6 months. So we study the climate change policies in France concerning the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, the carbon sink, the carbon footprint, climate change adaptations, and socio-economic impact. We have some recommendations for the policies, and we also present to the Parliament and get feedback from the Parliament. So this is indeed to accelerate the climate change transition in France by providing an independent and scientifically based expert advice. What we do is that we study the carbon budgets, the carbon footprints, the greenhouse gas emissions, and the trajectory towards the carbon neutrality in 2050. And we look at sectors. We look at the carbon budgets, which are set by the government for each sector, within what is called the National Strategy for Low Carbon. And we have also some studies of key indicators, which could be, for instance, such as one example for the transportation sector, the weight of the cars. If you produce cars that are really heavyweight, it's unlikely, even if they are with reduced emissions, you are reaching the target. Then we are also have a systematic study of the strategy, of the economic policy, of the levers and the roadblocks to the transition. We look into the social dimensions, so is the transition just? And we look at adaptation. And we look with this into the government plans, and we set some levels by saying that the plan could be credible, or that there are risks, or there are serious risks, or the plans are just not sufficient. So this is just the cover of our last annual report in 2024. where we remind the government that we need to have a clear and well-set direction to reach carbon neutrality in France by 2050. And this is essential to give visibility to the socio-economic world. And moreover, there is an important dimension with the climate change impact. So the public policies need to protect the households and the companies of the climate change impacts. So here you have just a short summary of the changes in greenhouse gas emissions in France and over a time span from 2010 to 2023. And you also see projections, which are actually the projections by the national strategy set by the government until 2030. And please remember that this pathway, this trajectory is consistent or should be consistent at least with the Fit for 55 package, which has been set by the European Union, stating that we would reduce by 55% our greenhouse gas emissions in 2030 compared to 1990. So we commented in that last year report what happened in 2023, and there were relatively good news because the reduction on 1 year to the next was by 5.8%. However, I can say that this is less than the mean in the European Union, which is minus 8% in 2023. All sectors have reduced emissions, but except the waste sector. 1/3, however, of this decline of emissions in 2023 is due to some factors that are not structural, that are from what happened in that year. For instance, I can say that we had in 2023 a catch-up of the nuclear energy production and nuclear electricity production. And this was because in 2022 there was a major uplift of the plants, of the production plants, and so this also explains why we got more electricity from nuclear power. The same happened with hydroelectricity, which was extremely low in 2022 because we had a very strong drought. So not everything in this decline is caused by structural factor. However, we have at least 15 megatons of CO2, which are structural and can be interpreted in the best scenario possible. As we note here, we'll come back to this, that as a carbon sink is around 20 megaton of CO2 equivalent since 2018, but it has been reduced strongly compared to what happened 10 years before. So let me try to explain the situation with main sectors. We have you have here, and all slides are in French. Sorry for those of you who would not read French, but you see here the breakdown by sector. So first one is transportation sector. That's a sector which is late. It's not really reducing emissions according to the pathways which have been set. The second one is agriculture. We will discuss more about agriculture today. It has really modest targets set by the government, so the reduction is quite small, but it is in fact keeping those targets. It is consistent with the targets. Industry has been reducing emissions strongly. We have still significant challenges with the buildings. Energy has reduced, but we have a problem with waste, which is a small sector, but is not really reducing its emissions. And as mentioned, the land use sink, the land sink is really has been strongly degraded. So when you take the balance of all this, you can say that the second carbon budget of France is unlikely to be respected. Although the gross emissions have been reduced by more than expected, by more than 100 megaton of CO2 equivalent more than expected. But however, the decline in the forest carbon sink creates a situation where the net sink, the net carbon balance is less than what was planned. So we would it is likely we will end up the second part carbon budget with a small excess, 0.7% of the budget planned, which underlines obviously the need to accelerate the decline in emissions and to restore the carbon sink in forest and soil. So if we focus now on this carbon sink in the sector, you have here some on the left a figure showing what was expected in the second national budget, which was to have a sink which was relatively low, really. So it is low, meaning that in fact in absolute terms it is high, it's negative. And we see that this negative value declined. And now the next government plan is likely to set a modest target for this forest sink. However, we underline here that we need really a large-scale national plan to regenerate forests and to store carbon in also in the soils and also in the agricultural biomass. Investments by the public sector have been increased to regenerate forests, but they are likely not yet to be sufficient. And we see also that we are using a lot of wood for energy, whereas it would be better to use it for biomaterials. And also the forestry practices are not really, the subsidies are not really conditioned to sustainable practices. And we also explain that too many of the grasslands are plowed up for agriculture, and that's also a problem. Yes, so clearly we need more work on the structural actions to reach carbon neutrality. And maybe I will not go into the details here because it's not so much in the same sector, but we have problems with renewable energy deployment. There is a lack of visibility on the next nuclear plants. When will they be ready? Insufficient plans concerning the forest carbon sink. There are some questions about the transport sector. Greening the transport sector is not happening as quickly as it should be happening. And for the building, the renovation rate is too low, and especially we underline the need for high quality renovation. And I will certainly focus in the next slide on the food systems, explaining what we need to do with food systems. However, although things may seem a bit late, there are some significant advances in terms of public policies. We now have a General Secretary for Ecological Planning, which is creating rather consistent scenarios, and this is helpful for previsibility, for consistency. But we have a big problem with our plans, which have been delayed by more than 1 year. So the plans for low carbon economy, for also adaptation, were expected in July 2023, and now they are still open for last consultations, so they are not ready and they are not operational. We definitely need some multi-annual funding, and we also need to stop the subsidies for fossil fuel energy, for fossil energies. And we need to just transition. There are really risks to block the transition because of inequalities. And I think this is also explained in the next slide. When there are subsidies, if they are for everybody, including people that do not really require subsidies for transitioning, it may be, I'm not sure how to translate this, aubaine. It may not be justified, let's say. And remember, we had this social demonstrations in France some years ago with what was called yellow jackets. And this was due to more taxes, which appeared quite abruptly. And so there is a need to well understand the economic vulnerability of households and businesses. There are also some specific territories where you need to have also some more options. Let's say, for instance, territories overseas in France or in the suburbs, some of the suburbs, or some of the rural areas. So you need to really carefully plan the way those territories and the households can contribute to the transition given their constraints. Yes, there is a lack sometimes of public sector jobs to support the transition. This is also needed, obviously. I will take just a few slides to go more into the details on the climate shocks we have in France and the need for adaptation. I think you all realize this. We have more and more of extreme heat waves, droughts, forest fires, floodings, and extreme rainfalls. And we have the sea level rise, and the coastal areas are affected quite quickly. Just in 2022, it is estimated we had an extra death toll of 3,000 people due to the heat waves, and the insured damages were of 11 billion euro just in 1 year. And this is only for the insured damages. In fact, the total costs of the damages is far more. So it is very clear that without adaptation to climate change, we will have more and more costs and some dramatic exposure of people, and unfortunately, it is likely the death toll will increase. So we have been explaining that we think that a reference trajectory is quite useful for the adaptation planning. And in fact, such a reference trajectory has been set for France, anticipating a warming of +4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. This is consistent with +3 degrees Celsius worldwide. So it is a sort of business as usual scenario, which unfortunately seems today a bit likely because the climate negotiations are not progressing so quickly. And so it is important that we do adapt to such risks. And integrating these trajectories, this reference trajectory, to the National Plan for Adaptation will increase consistency. Here again, we underline here that anticipating the impacts of climate change is far less expensive than compensating year after year the damages. And we are saying that we need to adapt to the infrastructures, especially, but also the buildings, to the flooding risks, to the submersion risks in the coastal areas. We need to build back better, obviously. And this means also there are some specific public funds that need to be reshuffled to help reducing the vulnerability. We need to reduce the risk of maladaptation. And yes, we need to have some possible studies on what is called here strategic planning, really. So imagine you have some houses which are in an area which could be submerged in the future, or with high risks of flash flooding or something like this. Obviously, you need to relocate the people, to relocate the businesses, and this needs long-term planning and some funding also. So let me now focus on the food system. We had a dedicated report on the food system where we argue that we should have a low carbon, obviously, but also resilient food system. And this can only work if it is also with some notion of social justice or equity. I'm sure that all of you know what is a food system. It starts with the food production and it goes down to the retail and to the waste and to the consumption of food. So it is really the full systems with all the inputs and all the outputs. We note that obviously the French food system is exposed to climate change shocks, and it is strongly contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. Here again, there are some shocks and damages which have been seen on the agricultural production, especially. For instance, 2022, we had some strong droughts the irrigation was stopped in more than half of our département, and we had some estimates of several billion euro of damages for agriculture. And we have many other examples. So we had recurring over the last 20 years, we had several large-scale droughts and several large-scale floods and also heavy rainfalls, which means that the crop production was harmed, plus obviously the frosts. So without going into the detail, you well understand the role of drought for crop production, the role of heat waves for crops, but also for animals, and the role of floods, which also harm the soils and can create some direct damages to the farms. We say that the risks are combined across the world producing regions. And so this means we may also have some economic shocks if you have several bread baskets which are affected simultaneously, for instance, by droughts. And we say that we need to develop climate services to modify the policies, the investments, the insurance systems, and to have a more inclusive governance of the climate and agricultural and food policies. So reminding you about the greenhouse gas emissions, this is the second sector in France, 18% of the national emissions, mostly from livestock, 60%, because also we have a contribution of the feed which is being produced for the livestock. Then you have crops, and then you have the energy use, fossil energy use in agriculture. So there has been a 13% decline since 1990 of those emissions, but there is an acceleration which is required. And the target for 2030 is minus 22%. That's at least in the values of the National Strategic Plan, which are still open to consultation. In addition, we observe that the agricultural soils are adding, in fact, to the net emissions, although they have a large storage capacity. And this is quite a bit because of a reduced grassland area. So plowing up the grasslands has contributed to emissions in the land use change forestry sector, the LULUCF sector. Yes, and so we need to work both on the side of reducing nitrous oxide and methane emissions and on storing more carbon in agricultural soils and in agricultural biomass, for instance, with agroforestry systems. The carbon footprint of the food system is in fact bigger than the agricultural emissions. And this is because agriculture as a sector is only 60% of that footprint. We see that agri-food industries could be up to 18%, transportation up to 14%, but there is also the trade and retail, which is contributing to the emissions. The imports are a strong part of the carbon footprint of the food systems in France. 46% of that footprint is from imports. And that just shows that, in fact, we need to act not only on what is produced, but also on what we consume. And indeed, the losses and wastes contribute to 15 megatons CO2 equivalent of emissions. That's really too much. So what could we do to change that situation and have a climatic transition in our food system? We can work with the practices, production practices in farms, but there are in fact some roadblocks here which are linked to the specialization of the different agricultural regions. which are also linked to some socioeconomic dimensions. For instance, the way the added value is shared is unequal. It has been tried to rebalance this through law, but it's not apparently working so well. So the farmers still have a relatively low share of the added value in the food chain. Indeed, there are several levers which have been identified to accelerate the climatic transitions. So when farmers change their systems and practices to adapt or to mitigate, they should be encouraged. And also training, capacity building, and working within territories and regions could help in governing, steering the food system in the right direction. There is a sort of a next generation of farmer who could really enact the changes, and they are mostly interested by those climate change possibilities, but they they are interested by the low carbon production mode. They are aware of the environmental problems, but they need to be supported to develop new skills and to have possibilities to change the way they manage their farms. When you look at the literature about agricultural adaptation to climate change, there are, let's say, two ways of thinking. The first one is what is called climate smart agriculture. It's mostly about technologies, smart technologies, and it is mostly about what we call incremental adaptation. So, meaning you're not changing the system, you're just changing the practices, adopting new technologies. And for instance, you could save water by having some more efficient irrigation systems. You can have some plant breeds or animal breeds that are more tolerant to the heat waves, for instance. Could diversify the crops to a limited extent. That's all part of what we call climate smart agriculture. And then there is agroecology, which is counting more on the ecological regulation in the production systems. And you could have some much stronger diversification of the landscapes, of the crops, of the farms. You could count on, say, agroforestry in different ways. And then you are, in fact, changing your system. So it is more demanding because it also implies, if you change your system, that the agri-food transformation chains and the consumption patterns may also need to change. And that's not so easy. Well, obviously, we all know what we need to do, technically speaking, to reduce nitrous oxide. You need to reduce the amounts and of inorganic and fertilizers, especially. Then for the animal emissions, you need to work with the feeding strategies, with the feed additives. That's a possibility. The way the animals are bred, and also the way you recycle the animal waste. So you can reduce with all this quite substantially. And I think there is something missing on the slide, which is the animal genetics, where you can also reduce your emissions. And generally speaking, you could reduce emissions per unit production down to minus 30% using and combining those best practices. Then there is possibility to store carbon sequestration in soils, obviously. This has a strong potential, especially in croplands. And you could produce more renewable energies and use less of the fossil energies. And this is not enough to work with the farm scale. You need to work also with the industries and with the retail. You cannot expect that the consumers will eat less animal proteins and more plant proteins if there is no specific effort about marketing and advertising for low carbon products. And then there are issues about transportation, obviously, when you would like to optimize and reduce the emissions from transportation systems. Covering now the options for food. First one is clearly to reduce waste and losses, but this is not so easy because there are some food security issues linked to the lifespan of the food produced. Already emphasized the need to reduce animal proteins compared to plant proteins. We surveyed, we reviewed the scenarios to reduce by 50% the sector emissions by 2050. And usually you have to reduce the animal protein production around 30%, reduce the N fertilizer inorganic N by 40 to 100%. I don't think it is at all possible to reduce by 100%, however, and to have a strong component of agroecology or organic farming, but then you're going to also reduce yields. So I'm going to conclude in a few slides. We here we're looking into the proposed laws about agriculture in France. They are possibly not providing a clear vision of what would be in the long term the agricultural production systems that would be encouraged in France, and also not providing a clear vision on how to articulate agriculture, food, and climate policies. And there are some interesting notions in those policies about training of the farmers, about supporting the low carbon farms when they are with young farmers, and to create some new industries. But there are also, and this can be seen in the national strategy for the proposed strategy for food, nutrition, and climate. This strategy would be a major opportunity that would allow to connect or reconnect agriculture, food, and climate. However, this strategy has been proposed, but it is not yet on the table to be adopted or to be. So we were a bit worried that this interesting policy doesn't seem to be so far supported. And we've been also looking into the National Strategic Plan for the Common Agricultural Policy, and it is a modest contribution of that plan to the climate action, between 7 and 24% of the total budget. And the plan doesn't have options on some key emissions factors like methane from enteric fermentation. And the objective for reducing nitrous oxide and methane are too low compared to the national strategy on reducing emissions. So we concluded this report, which was published, in fact, last year, that we need to accelerate the transition towards food systems that is low carbon, resilient, and has some social dimensions, that we need to improve the public policies and their consistency with the carbon neutrality by 2050, that also we should strengthen the climate dimensions in the existing or forthcoming policies, and that we need to support the regions, the cities, or sorry, the territories for their climate actions, and to have capacity building, training, to integrate climate dimensions in the evaluation of public policies, and also to have some changes in the common agricultural policy to make it far more compatible with the climate dimensions and more consistent with the food and health policy. So I hope I haven't been too long with that presentation, and I thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Jean-François, for your very clear and nice talk. And you show very well the mismatch between the recommendation of the HCC and the evolution of the current policies. It was very interesting to see that. We have time for questions. And okay, we have a first question by... so the microphone is arriving. Maybe you can tell your name before, because Jean-François is remote.
Hi, Jean-François. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So, Laurent Saint-André from INRAE. Salut. As you know, forest ecosystems are shelterwood for biodiversity, for carbon, and so on. And we are facing a crisis now that makes the national strategy in balance, because forests were expected to cover emissions as far as possible. And in your talk, I haven't seen any points on that.
Yes.
And then, what is the position of the High Council of that? And what, because of course it's important to to increase the carbon sink in agricultural systems, in crop systems, and so on. But it's also important to avoid losses in forest ecosystems. So
Yes.
what is the strategy now?
Thank you, Laurent. So I think you didn't, you missed slides which were at the start. If I may, I don't know where to go with this system, but I will try to show it again. It was before the part on the food systems. So here you have what was our message, which is, I think, consistent with what you're saying. We are saying that you need to have, there is urgency in creating a national plan about regenerating forests and storing carbon in also obviously in the forest, but also in the soils and the agricultural biomass. So if you read our reports, you will see quite a lot on this urgency. So we are clearly taking this into account. And you are quite right. It is, in fact, and this was in another slide, because we had this large decline in the forest carbon sink, that we could not reach our carbon budget for the second national plan. In terms of gross emissions, we did a bit better than expected, but the decline in the carbon sink from forests means that in terms of net emissions, and that's what is counting for climate change, obviously, the atmosphere doesn't separate gross and it's only affected by the net emissions. We missed the target by a small amount, apparently, 15 megaton of CO2, but we did apparently miss the target.
Yeah. Then what is the strategy?
Well, what is the strategy is to have, I think, first of all, you need to identify which areas in the French forests are with forest declines, and you're the expert, Laurent. And there were quite a few reports by the national academies about this. And then you need to engage into regenerating the forests. But there are obviously contrasted situations. There are areas which have been burning. There are areas where you have drought-induced declines, insect-induced declines, and so on. And this would take large efforts in terms of having tree seedlings that need to be replanted. We know that's also difficult because of the droughts impacting the tree seedlings. We know also it is difficult to protect those areas because they may be impacted by the wild fauna, so the young trees can be destroyed. And there are huge debates in France about which tree species we need to replant. Some people think you should certainly not plant anything exotic. Others are a bit more open to this idea. But generally speaking, there is a recommendation about planting mixed forests that would be more resilient. I don't know if I have time to expand on this much more because it's something where there are many ongoing discussions at least.
Thanks.
Thanks. Do we have some other question? So, yeah, I have a few questions. So, Jean-François, you said that the France is, or the HCC is thinking about the adaptation with +4 degrees for France. Is it considered as a pessimistic option and to be prepared to everything, or is it really the trajectory we are on?
So it is not the HCC that makes that recommendation. It is an official recommendation, which is actually part of the national plan for climate change adaptation, which is open, I should say, to consultation. So you may all want to contribute to this and advise on this plan. And in that plan, there is this reference trajectory for climate change adaptation. And I think that the philosophy here is that we should be prepared to something that could be based on business as usual emission scenarios, because if we were to prepare the country only for, let's say, a world which would stay at 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is unfortunately quite unlikely today, we would create some additional damages and risks for the population, and this would not be would be in terms of risk management would not be the optimal approach. But I think obviously if the government was to say we are planning to not to go for carbon neutrality by 2050, not to reduce our emissions by 55% by 2030. Plus, we are taking this reference trajectory for adaptation. Then it would be very bad news because it would basically say we are not ambitious enough for our climate policies. But that's not the case so far, at least. We do have this target of minus 55% by 2030 and the carbon neutrality by 2050. And although as I explained, the second national budget has been missed by 0.7%, that's, let's say, a small amount compared to the size of the budget. So France is not doing so bad in terms of emissions reduction so far. We do have this big problem with the forestry carbon sinks, that's true. But for the gross emissions, we are not as a total doing so bad. So we are not in a situation where there is an official ambition that would be too low for for carbon emissions. But it may seem realistic to set a reference trajectory for adaptation that is based on business as usual.
Okay. Okay, we have a question there.
Yes, thank you for the talk. Jean-Martial Coard from Grenoble. I have a question about developing countries, and is there any thoughts in the committee about some sequestration or reduction of CO2 that we have to account for what the developing countries will produce?
Okay. Yes, thank you. That's something which we did not explicitly address. We are looking into the national policies. Then we are looking in this committee into the, let's say, the international policies of France. So how is France supporting the negotiations? But please remember that, in fact, France is part of the European Union, and it is the European Union that is negotiating in the international negotiations. So it is rather a question for the EU itself. And I would like here to refer to another committee. I'm a member of the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change. And we have produced a report on the 2040 target for emissions in the EU. And we propose that we would have a reduction by minus 90 to minus 95% compared to 1990 of the greenhouse gas emissions, of the CO2 emissions actually. And we argued in this report, which you can find online obviously, that this was because this level of reduction was plausible technically or socioeconomically, but also because it was needed since we have a historical responsibility compared to developing countries. So we argued that it was needed to take the strongest reduction possible given this historical responsibility. So this is taken into account, at least in this report, at the EU scale.
Okay, we have a question here.
Hello, Jean-François, Bertrand Guenet from CNRS. I have a question on the forestry sink. We consider only mainland France, or is it also overseas territory?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, obviously it has to be also overseas territory, and that's especially French Guiana. And just now we know there is a strong drought right now in French Guiana. I'm not sure what are the implications for the forest, but it could well be very large. So we certainly will try to keep track of this and also keep track of the risks of deforestation in, say, French Guiana. So that's part of the story. But what I would like to say, because it's really nice to be able to talk with you today, is that we rely on the information, on the data that are published by the scientific community. So what you are looking into, what you are publishing, is essential for such reports. For instance, when we had the severe drought in 2022, we were alerted by several colleagues and several labs about the risks for the carbon sink, both from soils and from forests. And we could get some quite early on some data that have been published a bit later about the changes in the carbon sinks, the loss of carbon through fires. And this was really very useful for our report. So collaborating together is extremely useful. And I would really like to develop this further.
Hi, Jean-François. Stéphane de Cara, INRAE. Thank you for the presentation. That was very, very nice. But the more we see the gap between the ambition and what's actually done, and the closer the time horizon gets, the more difficult it is to imagine that the transition that the committee asked for accelerating the transition will be smooth. Are we ready? And I'm not sure we're ready to envisage scenarios where the transition is actually violent, with lots of farms going out of business because they cannot either stand the implications of climate change, or they cannot make the required changes in emissions to keep up with the targets. So, are we equipped to envisage such scenarios where the transitions are kind of violent and not smooth? And yeah, that's the idea.
Well,
it's also a question for us, of course. But
I think it's also a question for you, exactly, because one thing I can say is that our committee is trying to work more and more with other committees, because this issue is so big. It is difficult to understand all aspects of the climate change transition issues. So we are working on the financial aspects. We are discussing at least more and more with La Cour des Comptes, which is a major institution in France reporting on the budget. And recently, we auditioned also the le Haut Conseil pour la lutte contre l'exclusion et la pauvreté. And this committee has produced a very interesting report on the social dimensions of climate change. So that's just one example where we try to work with others to understand the way the transition could be managed. But it is very clear today that the current policies are not able to engage all people that would like to contribute because they are harmed, if I may say, by some economic impacts or of the policies which are planned. So really, it's a key issue, and I just encourage all the colleagues working in socioeconomics to work on this more and to help us.
Brea from Université de Lille. You mentioned in your presentation that 46% of the footprint of food industry comes from imports. If I'm not mistaken, 46%, that's the number I got. I'm wondering, following the question from our colleague regarding Mercosur and the issue with the agriculture, how this could impact, because we have two conflicting situations. In one scenario, we need to lower the emissions, and in the other scenario, we would like to expand commerce. So how we can deal with these two conflicting objectives from the economic perspective?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, the 46% value, it's about the share of the carbon footprint of France that is linked to imports. So it's quite big. We are importing quite a lot. Please note we are importing mostly within the European Union, and we are exporting also within the European Union. So it's not exactly the same as with Latin America. But your question is very timely because we see the farmers' protests about this Mercosur agreement. So there are some clear problems with European policies because on the one hand, Europe would like to expand international trade and would like to benefit from this expansion of international trade. We would have, I think, quite a lot to gain economically from having less trade barriers in terms of exporting more services. But on the other hand, we see that we are importing, let's say, some livestock. There is also an issue about the importations leading to deforestation. That is a big controversy in terms of trade and diplomacy. And actually, the Commission wants to set rules to avoid importing products with high CO2 footprint. So it is, you are quite right, not so easy to see how all this can be combined. And now we have France asking to stop the Mercosur free trade agreement. And we have also, at least in the European Parliament, some discussions about delaying the regulation on imported deforestation. So it is clear that it is not so easy. Well, on the other hand, if we keep to the discussion on the food system, what the farmer representatives tell you when you say you would need to do more about mitigating, let's say, methane emissions, enteric methane and so on, they say, well, if you tax us for those emissions and so on, then we will get more imports. So should you restrict the imports? That's a question. And it is, in fact, somewhere in the discussions in the European Union, should we have also restriction of imports of, let's say, high footprint products from third parties, also for food. It's nothing official, obviously, but it is discussed also. I don't have an answer. Huh? It's very difficult.
Okay. Hi, Jean-François. Jean-Marc Blasi from INRAE Guadeloupe. So there is a great heterogeneity between farmers with regard to soil carbon sequestration potential. This raises questions of equity and social justice between farmers. So I think we need agricultural policies that take into account this heterogeneity. So how could this be done, given the fact that most of the time policies are the same for everyone?
Yes, a good question. Well, I'm sure you're aware that we now have what is called the EU CRCF, carbon regulation, carbon farming framework, where the intention is to have some possibilities to harmonize the way farmers are paid for their carbon sequestration. So this is a first step that is likely to lead to sort of a large-scale development of voluntary carbon markets for agriculture. At least that is the expectation from the Commission. And the DG Climat also mentions that after 2030, such a carbon market could become, in one way or another, compulsory, at least for the big farms. So one thing is that they say this could be only for the big farms, because they know the small farms could possibly not make it. So that's part of the answer for your question. But I think you're quite right. And well, in this room, Stefan could maybe answer you better than me. Huh? He's really studying this. But it is clear that depending on the way those markets are set, they could have some really negative impacts on small farmers. So much care needs to be taken in creating such market mechanisms.
Thanks, and it's also a nice teaser for the Clean Farm project that will deal partly with these questions. Okay, so if we don't have any questions, so and we have to move on, and so thanks a lot, Jean-François, for this presentation. It was great.
Thank you all. Thank you. Have a nice workshop. Bye.
And thanks a lot for responding to the question. Bye.